They built a machine to exhaust people to death. Then they called it reform. Imagine you are standing on a large wooden paddle wheel. The steps beneath your feet rotate constantly downward. To stay upright, you have to keep stepping up. You cannot stop. You cannot slow down. You cannot step off. The wheel does not care whether you are tired. The wheel does not care whether your legs are shaking or your lungs are burning. The wheel only cares that you keep moving, because the moment you stop, the step beneath you forces you down, and the guard watching from the platform notes that you have failed to maintain pace. You have been on this machine for 3 hours. You will be on it for 3 more. You will do this again tomorrow. This was the treadmill, a machine designed in 1818 by a British engineer named William Cubitt, installed in prisons across Britain and the British Empire, and operated every day for 80 years. Prison reformers called it more humane than flogging. The medical officers who examined prisoners called it something more complicated. And by the end of this video, you will understand exactly what kind of civilization looks at a machine that exhausts people toward death and decides to call that progress. To understand why the treadmill was considered a reform rather than a punishment, you have to understand what British prisons were like before it arrived, and what the reformers of the era were genuinely trying to fix. In the late 18th century, British prisons were chaotic, overcrowded, and largely unstructured. Prisoners of different offenses, different ages, and different levels of criminal experience were held together without meaningful separation, supervision, or routine. The dominant punishment tools were flogging, hard labor in chain gangs, transportation to penal colonies, and execution. A reform movement had been building since the 1770s, driven by figures like John Howard and later Elizabeth Fry, who argued that prisons should not simply punish but should reform the people inside them, changing their character and habits so that they could re-enter society as productive members rather than repeat offenders. The reformers believed, with genuine conviction, that idleness was the root of criminal behavior. A person with nothing to do would fill that nothing with vice. A person kept constantly occupied with disciplined labor would develop the habits of industry, regularity, and self-control that would make them law-abiding citizens after release. This was not a cynical argument. It was a sincere theory of human behavior held by people who genuinely wanted to improve both the prisoners and the society that had to live alongside them after release. William Cubitt was an engineer, not a reformer. In 1818, the governor of Berry Street Edmonds Jail asked him to design something that could keep prisoners occupied without requiring tools, materials, or skills that could be misused or stolen. Cubitt's solution was elegant in the engineering sense. A large cylinder, like a paddle wheel, mounted horizontally on an axle, with wooden steps attached around its circumference. Prisoners walked on the steps, their weight causing the cylinder to rotate, their continuous stepping required to keep pace with the rotation. The cylinder could be connected to a grain mill or a water pump, making the labor nominally productive. Or it could be connected to nothing at all, the rotation simply dissipating through a resistance mechanism, the labor producing only exhaustion. That version, the one connected to nothing, was called the grinding the wind configuration. The reformers loved it. A prisoner on the treadmill was occupied, was disciplined, was developing regular habits of labor, was not idle. That it was also relentless, monotonous, and physically punishing beyond what most forms of free labor required was not considered a flaw in the design. It was considered the point. But here is the detail that changes everything you just heard. The treadmill was not replacing a crueler punishment. For many prisoners, it was replacing nothing at all. They had committed minor offenses, vagrancy, petty theft, being drunk in public. And for those offenses, Victorian Britain put them on a machine and walked them toward collapse. Every single day. Now here is what the treadmill actually felt like from inside the experience of walking it, and what the medical officers who worked in Victorian prisons began to document as the years accumulated. A typical treadmill session lasted for 6 hours per day, broken into intervals of 15 to 20 minutes on the wheel followed by short rest periods off it. During the active period, a prisoner climbed the equivalent of several thousand feet of vertical elevation without moving horizontally at all. The motion was not walking. It was climbing continuously against a surface that descended beneath you, requiring your legs to work harder than level walking in order simply to maintain position. Imagine climbing stairs for 20 minutes without stopping, then resting for 5, then climbing again, then resting, then climbing for 6 hours, then doing it the next day, then the next. The physical effects accumulated. Prison medical officers, whose role required them to examine prisoners regularly, began noting patterns that connected to treadmill use specifically. Chronic knee and ankle joint damage from the repetitive strain of the stepping motion on a surface that did not absorb impact the way natural ground does. Respiratory problems from sustained exertion in enclosed spaces that were often poorly ventilated. Heart strain in older prisoners or those with pre-existing conditions that had not been identified before sentencing. And in documented cases, death. The deaths were not dramatic. They were the quiet, gradual kind that could be attributed to prior weakness, to the general poor health of the prison population, to any number of causes that were easier to record than the specific contribution of a machine that had been operating the prisoner's body past its sustainable limits every day for months. The prison governors and the reformers who visited prisons were not unintelligent people. They could see the prisoners on the treadmill. They could see what the extended sessions were doing to bodies that were often already weakened by poverty, inadequate nutrition, and the general conditions of 19th century working class life. They continued the treadmill because the reform theory required it. An idle prisoner was a prisoner whose character was not being improved. A tired prisoner was a prisoner who was learning the habits of labor. The fact that the labor was pointless, that the mill was sometimes connected to nothing, that the exhaustion served no agricultural or industrial purpose, was secondary to the moral purpose the exhaustion was supposed to serve. The machine was not about production. It was about the prisoner, specifically, about breaking whatever in the prisoner had led them to crime and replacing it with something more socially acceptable. That this process was also, in measurable ways, breaking their bodies was a detail the theory had not anticipated, and the practice declined to resolve. But the most revealing moment in this story is not the treadmill itself. It is what Oscar Wilde wrote about it after he survived one. Because Wilde was not a poor vagrant or a petty criminal. He was one of the most famous writers in the world. And what he described from inside the experience is the closest thing we have to a first-person account of what the treadmill actually was. Stay with me. Oscar Wilde was sentenced to 2 years hard labor in 1895 for gross indecency. He served his sentence at Reading Jail, where the treadmill was a regular feature of the daily routine. Wilde was not physically robust. He was 40 years old, accustomed to comfort, and entirely unprepared for the physical demands of prison labor. He described the treadmill in letters and later in the Ballad of Reading Jail as a form of systematic physical destruction that operated on a principle the institution never acknowledged. The treadmill made no distinction between the strong and the weak, the young and the old, the healthy and the already damaged. The wheel rotated at the same pace regardless of who was walking on it. A man who had spent his life doing manual labor and a man who had spent his life writing plays stepped onto the same steps at the same speed and were expected to perform identically. When they could not, the failure was attributed to their character rather than to the machine's design. Wilde's testimony is valuable precisely because he had the literary skill to describe what most treadmill prisoners could not. He described the sensation of the machine as a kind of erasure. The mind gradually unable to hold any thought beyond the immediate physical demand of the next step. The literary imagination that had produced some of the most celebrated works of the Victorian era reduced to nothing but the animal calculation of whether the legs could continue. He described watching other prisoners around him, men who had done nothing more than sleep rough or steal bread, subjected to the same mechanical exhaustion as himself. And he wrote about this with a fury that his pre-prison work had never contained. His post-prison writing, The Ballad of Reading Jail and De Profundis, are considered among his finest work. They were produced entirely from the perspective of someone who had been inside the machine. In 1895, the year of Wilde's conviction, a report by Dr. Richard Gover, the medical inspector of prisons, formally documented the health damage caused by the treadmill and recommended that its use be curtailed. His report was noted. It was not immediately acted upon. The Prisons Act of 1898 finally abolished the treadmill, 80 years after Cubitt designed it and 3 years after Wilde walked it. The abolition came not from a sudden moral awakening about the dignity of prisoners. It came because the accumulating medical evidence had made the machine's cost impossible to officially ignore. The same pattern as the climbing boy, the same 80-year gap between evidence and action. The same question of whose comfort was being prioritized while the evidence was being accumulated. If this story is sitting with you in a way you did not expect, the like is how you tell me that. It also tells YouTube that this kind of history matters, which means the algorithm shows it to more people who have never heard it. That is the only way these stories reach beyond the people already looking for them. And if you want to keep finding the version of history that nobody put in your textbook, this is where it lives. The subscribe button means the next one finds you before you have to go looking for it. The treadmill was abolished in 1898. The Prisons Act replaced it with other forms of labor, actual productive work that prisons could use or sell, which reformers had argued for decades was more genuinely rehabilitative than exhaustion for its own sake. The specific machine is gone, but stand in any modern gym and look at the treadmill in the corner. The word comes directly from the prison device. The machine you pay a monthly membership to use voluntarily, for your health, for your well-being, because moving without going anywhere has become a leisure activity, is named after the instrument of punishment that Victorian Britain used to break people. The irony is not subtle, but it is also not the point. The point is what the treadmill story reveals about how societies manage the gap between what they believe about themselves and what they are actually doing. Victorian Britain believed it was the most civilized, most progressive, most humane society in human history. It also built a machine to walk people to death and called it reform. These two things were not experienced as contradictions by the people who believed both simultaneously. The prison reformers who championed the treadmill were not hypocrites in the sense of knowing they were wrong and proceeding anyway. They were people whose theory of human improvement was sincere, but whose theory had a design flaw. The flaw was that the people the theory was being applied to were not consulted about whether the application was working. The prisoners could not vote, could not publish, could not address Parliament, could not commission a medical report. When Oscar Wilde, who could do all of these things, came off the treadmill and wrote about it, the account became one of the most powerful indictments of the Victorian prison system ever produced. And Wilde was there for 2 years. Most of the people on the treadmill before him were there for months and left no record at all. The next time someone tells you that a system is humane because the people who designed it intended it to be, ask whose experience is being used to measure that. The designers of the treadmill intended it to be humane. The people walking it had a different experience. One of those two groups got to define what the machine was. It was not the people on it. Here is what I want to know. The reformers genuinely believed the treadmill was humane. Is there something happening in the world right now that you think future generations will look back on the same way? Something that the people designing it genuinely believe? Is progress? Tell me in the comments. This is just one machine history kept running for 80 years after it should have been stopped. You already know where to find the rest.